When Daniel died, I was 27. Everything I knew about life collapsed in a single night. The house, once filled with the smells of coffee and children's shampoo, became hollow and foreign. Silence pressed against the walls against me, until I thought I might suffocate. I lived in Warrenfield, a small town in upstate New York where nights seemed longer, darker, heavier than anywhere else. Daniel had worked at the mill. I had been an ordinary woman. Home, children, groceries, bills. Then he was gone, and all that remained was a small insurance payout that barely lasted half a year. And silence. My son Ben was 10 then, already too old for his age, carrying water, folding laundry, watching me with the steady eyes of someone who knew childhood had ended too soon. My daughter Lila was younger, still spinning in circles with dolls and clay figurines. I worked nights at the pharmacy, cleaned the school during the day. Sometimes I collapsed in the hallway still in my shoes, and Ben would cover me with his jacket. I didn't cry. Not once. I only stared at ceilings, calculating how much longer I could hold out. But Nathan was there. Always there. He wasn't mine by blood, though people rarely understood the truth. Daniel's first wife had left when Nathan was barely 3, unwilling to be tied to the kind of life Warrenfield demanded. She despised this place, despised Daniel for keeping it, despised me most of all when he married me. And Nathan. He had stayed. Daniel fought for custody and won. I was just a teenager when I first met Nathan, a quiet boy with solemn eyes who studied me as if searching for some hidden answer. He grew up under my roof, ate at my table, sat at my Christmas mornings. When Ben was born, Nathan was the one who carried him around the house like a fragile treasure. When Lila arrived, it was Nathan who rocked her to sleep when exhaustion knocked me flat. To the world he was my stepson. To me he was something else I dared not define. Because even then, before Daniel died, there had been a current between us. Faint, unspoken, like a string pulled too tight between two people who must never acknowledge it. After the funeral, when the neighbors left with their empty casserole dishes and condolences faded into silence, that current changed, deepened. It became impossible to ignore. Nathan was 24 then, tall, broad-shouldered, quiet like his father but with a softness Daniel never had. He carried the weight of the household without being asked, fixed what broke, sat with Ben during homework, let Lila braid his hair until she giggled herself tired. But at night, when the younger children slept, I felt his presence in ways I shouldn't have. His footsteps in the hallway, the sound of water in the bathroom, the light shifting under his door. My chest tightened at each reminder. Sometimes I caught him watching me when he thought I wouldn't notice. Eyes that didn't see me as a mother, or even as his father's widow. Eyes that saw me. One morning I came into the kitchen in a faded t-shirt, hair tangled, exhausted from a double shift. Nathan stood by the stove, pouring coffee. He looked at me, his gaze lingering too long. "You never sleep," he said softly. "Your eyes tell on you." The words pierced me more than any comfort I had been offered in 5 years. He reached for a plate at the same moment I did. Our fingers touched. The spark of it jolted through me like fire. Pulled away too quickly. My voice faltered. "I'm fine." His jaw tightened, but his voice stayed steady. "You don't have to be." I turned away before silence betrayed me. That night, lying awake, I pressed my hand against my stomach, trembling not from fear of Nathan, but from fear of myself. Something forbidden had already taken root. Something that could never be spoken. Because if anyone knew, if his mother knew, she would burn me to ash with her hatred. And Nathan, he had already chosen me long ago. Chosen me over her. That was why no one could ever find out. And why I couldn't stop trembling when his eyes found mine. Grief rearranged the house, but it rearranged us more. The days sharpened into duties. Lists I clung to like railings. Ben's homework. Lila's lunch notes. Floor's bills, the pharmacy, the school. And Nathan. Always there, a quiet axis the other spun around. It began like a change in weather no one could name. Not a storm yet, just a pressure shift. The air in the kitchen felt weightier when he entered. The hallway seemed narrower when we passed each other on the stairs. I told myself it was only the new math of the household, the way people lean closer when they're afraid of falling. But sometimes while I rinsed dishes, I felt the warmth of his gaze settle and stay. On my hands beneath the water, on the curve of my shoulder where a loose sleeve slipped, on the line of my neck when I tilted my head to tie my hair. I'd glance up and he'd be looking away already, as if the room had called his attention somewhere else. The doubt was mine to hold alone. Was I imagining it? Was grief turning me into a fool? Nights were the worst. I'd come home from the pharmacy smelling of antiseptic and coffee, and the house would be quiet but awake. One light in the living room, a second in the kitchen. Nathan would be at the table with a ledger and a mug, calculator resting under his palm. He'd look up and say nothing at first, just slide the kettle back on for me like we had always been two sides of the same routine. "Tea?" he'd ask. "I can make it," I'd answer, reaching for the cup. Our fingers would meet on the handle, pause, retreat. Heat. Then the wave that fought the bomb. Little things began to collect like stones in a pocket. He fixed the back door latch without being asked. Installed a shelf for the kids' shoes and lined them up himself. Ben's scuffed sneakers, Lila's two perfect pairs in a row. When the washing machine bucked itself into a sulk, he knelt beside it, arm deep in the metal throat, and when he couldn't reach a bolt, he asked me to hold a flashlight. We were shoulder to shoulder, the smell of clean cotton rising around us. My breath shortened, a ridiculous, traitorous thing, and the beam trembled in my hand. He steadied my wrist just a touch. "Got it," he said softly. The word landed lower than it needed to, as if the machine had swallowed it and thrown it back warm. On a Tuesday, rain broke open at noon and ran hard until dusk. The power flickered and Lila cried from upstairs, afraid her nightlight would die without warning. Nathan went to her room with a small lantern and told stories about brave foxes who carried bulbs in their mouths like moons. I listened from the hallway and wondered when his voice had become the sound I trusted. When he came out, I was standing there with a blanket around my shoulders. He reached to tug it closer, fingers brushing my collarbone, an accident that wasn't one. I stepped back and he did too, both of us apologizing to the air between us as if it had been the rude one. I worried that I was inventing it. That grief had turned my skin into a tuning fork that hummed for any kindness. But then there were his eyes, steady, careful, returning to me as if they had a route of their own. And the way he found reasons to be near. "Need help with receipts?" he'd ask when my desk drowned under papers. "Let me lift that," when a box was only moderately heavy. "You missed a button," when I'd fasten my coat too quickly and he'd fix it, fingers sure and brief, finishing the shape and stepping away as if he feared a second more would tell on him. At dinner the tension pretended to be nothing. We passed salt and bread, corrected math facts, asked Lila to chew slower. Yet our attention ran quietly beneath the table, two rivers meeting out of sight. If my glass was low, his hand would reach first. If he stood to clear plates, I stood too, and in the narrow corridor by the sink our shoulders would glance like strangers at a crowded doorway. Polite, accidental, not accidental at all. He began running in the mornings. "Helps me think," he said. He'd return flushed, hair damp at the temples, the house still blue with early light. I would be at the counter packing lunches, telling myself not to look. I always looked. The shape of him was a sentence I refused to read and could recite by heart. He'd open the fridge and the cool air would slip past me, and I would feel it like a hand. I told myself it was my imagination because admitting it was real would tear the floor out from under us. He was my adopted son. He had slept under my roof since he was a child. He had called this house safe because I had said it was. To feel anything else was a kind of treachery, wasn't it? To him, to the younger children, to the memory of the man we both loved. And beyond our door, the town waited with its eyes. And somewhere not far away, a woman who had never forgiven me for being chosen, his mother, would devour us with her hatred if she ever learned what sat, quiet and bright, between the two of us at the kitchen table. Still, the days gathered their heat. In the backyard, I hung sheets on the line, the wind making brief ghosts of them. Nathan brought the clothespins I'd forgotten, holding the basket out like an offering. Our fingers met again and again as we clipped white to white. The sun burned through one sheet and cast my outline across him. He didn't move. I felt the outline move with my breath. Mine, then ours, then mine again. The pin slipped. He caught it. "Careful," he murmured, eyes not leaving my face. I looked down, not because I was careful but because looking at him told the truth too loudly. A week later, he sliced his palm on a stubborn jar lid. It was nothing, one bright line and a startled sound, but I took his hand anyway and led him to the sink. The water ran warm. I ran warmer. I dabbed wrapped Tide. His hand was a landscape I had known since it fit inside mine. All the small scars, the callus at the base of his finger from a hammer he'd used all summer when he was 19, the line I'd kissed once when he was 8 and fell off his bike. I tied the knot too slowly. He didn't pull away. "Thank you," he said, and the thanks was for more than the gauze. "Don't be foolish," I said, meaning, don't make me foolish. He smiled, the private kind no one else could read. The wave kept resisting the bomb. Duty, fear, the history of our house, everything pushed back. And yet heat traveled its own paths, along wire and water and the narrow mile of a hallway at midnight. Sometimes I woke because I thought I heard him pause outside my door. I would hold my breath, counting, and then there would be the soft retreat of his steps. In the morning I'd tell myself it had been the settling of the old wood, the house remembering how to stand. On Sunday, after church I didn't attend, a neighbor stopped me at the mailbox. "How are the kids?" she asked, eyes searching for the kind of drama small towns live on. I said we were fine. She nodded, then lowered her voice. "You're lucky to have Nathan." The words slid past like a blade hidden in linen. A son like that staying to help. Not many boys would. I smiled and agreed, and later in the kitchen, I repeated the sentence to myself without the neighbor's meaning. "You're lucky to have Nathan." Luck didn't cover it. Luck didn't explain the way my hands shook when I set spoons beside bowls and heard his footfall on the stairs. We didn't speak of any of it. Not the glances that held a second longer than necessary. Not the small excuses to touch. Not the way our voices softened when we said each other's names as if even consonants could be too sharp. Silence was our promise and our punishment. We kept it for the children, for the town, for the woman who would set us both on fire with one rumor. We kept it because saying anything would make it real, and then we would have to choose a world to lose. One night, the power finally went out for real. The house turned to ink. Ben and Lila called from their rooms. Nathan lit candles, one after another, and their circles of light floated like moons through the dark. When the kids settled, we stood in the kitchen with only one candle left between us. The flame wavered and steadied, and in that little gold, we were no longer duties plotting their routes. We were two people, breathing, close enough that I could count the flecks of green in his brown eyes. "Hannah," he said very quietly. I looked at his mouth and then away. "Yes." He shook his head. "Nothing." The candle burned lower. Heat pressed close. The wave, the bomb, the wave again. I blew the candle out, and in the dark our silence said everything we could not. Started with silence. The kind that came only when the children's doors were shut, when the dishes had been dried and put away, when the town itself seemed to dim its breath. The house grew small in those hours. Too small for two people carrying a storm between them. For weeks the tension had risen like heat pressed under glass. A hand brushing too close while passing plates. His gaze lingering too long on my collarbone, my throat. The way my own heart betrayed me when he stepped into the kitchen, when he leaned over me to reach for a mug and I felt the warmth of his chest at my back. One night, when the quiet pressed hardest, there was a knock on my door. Careful. A knock that already knew the answer. "Hannah." His voice was barely more than breath. I should have told him to go. I should have reminded him of the lines drawn around us. but instead I opened the door. He stood there in a plain t-shirt, the shadows of the hall deepening the shape of his jaw. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then he whispered, "I can't keep pretending." Something inside me broke. I reached for his hand and felt it tremble in mine. We didn't speak as he led me across the hallway into his room. The air there was different, thicker, warmer, alive with something that had waited too long. At first, we only stood close, as if testing the gravity that pulled us together. His forehead brushed mine, our breaths tangled. The hesitation between us was more dangerous than the kiss itself. Then finally he closed that space. It wasn't a rush. It was slow, searching, as if he was afraid I might vanish if he pressed too hard. His lips touched mine like a confession he'd carried for years. I answered, trembling, my hands against his chest, feeling the rapid drum of his heart. The kiss deepened, not wild but aching, full of the hunger we had swallowed in silence. When he pulled back, his eyes searched mine. "Tell me to stop, and I will." I shook my head. My voice wouldn't come, but my silence was enough. From that night on, the house held a secret. Each evening, after Ben and Lila had surrendered to sleep, after the last lamp was switched off, I found myself crossing the hall. Sometimes he came to me. More often I slipped into his room, the door closing softly behind us like a vow. We didn't need words. The world outside had stolen those from us. Instead, we spoke in glances, in fingertips trailing along arms, in whispered laughter muffled by pillows. His hands learned me carefully, reverently, as though he had memorized every detail years before and was only now allowed to touch the truth of it. Our kisses were long, burning, desperate but quiet. Always quiet. The walls felt too thin, the risk too sharp. Yet the danger only made the fire stronger. I lay in his arms some nights, listening to the rise and fall of his breath, the steady rhythm of his heart beneath my cheek. We were hidden even from ourselves, holding on as if morning might erase what night allowed. No one could know. Not the neighbors. Not the children. Especially not the woman who had once given him life and despised me for giving him a home. Her hatred would scorch us both if she learned the truth, that Nathan had chosen me long ago, and I, despite every boundary, had chosen him back. In the daylight we were careful. I kept my eyes lowered, my hands busy. He moved around me as though nothing had changed. But in the evenings behind his closed door, we lived another life, a forbidden life, carved from the hours no one else could see. It was dangerous. It was wrong. It was inevitable. And in his arms, with his lips against mine, I stopped asking for permission from the world. Because in that room in the dark, he wasn't my stepson. He was the only man who had ever truly seen me.